What did it look like when the samurai lords of Japan went to war at sea, either against each other as feuding clans, or united in a massed invasion of Korea? In this video, we shall explore the all-too-often overlooked topic of naval warfare in medieval Japan. From the methods of ship construction to the major warship classes, the fleet formations, the combat tactics, and the historical battles. This is the true size of a samurai navy.
You can relive the Sengoku Jidai, the wars with Korea, and even take on the whole world on behalf of Japan with today's sponsor, Europa Universalis 5. As the latest Paradox title, EU5 brings you all the incredible depth of grand strategy you can expect from this series. If you've never played before, this includes an expansive global map that can be zoomed in all the way to the granular level of individual cities and provinces. Here, everything from biomes to resources, cultures, religions, commerce, and more is modeled at an incredible level of detail and historical fidelity. In the game, you pick from hundreds of nations to guide their destiny from the Middle Ages of the late 14th century to the Age of Revolution in the early 19th century. Whether you want to build, govern, negotiate, trade, explore, whatever, there's endless ways to explore the sandbox. If you're already familiar with the series, EU5 mixes features from a lot of recent titles like EU4, Victoria 3, and Imperator. You've got an economy with pops, markets with prices based on an equilibrium of supply and demand, dynamic trade routes, armies with tons of regiments, and a giant tech tree with branching paths for age progression. There's also lots of good player requested feedback in here, like no more building slot caps, advisors being replaced with cabinets, and I could go on. But for me, the best change is the addition of automation buttons for a lot of features, specifically for colonization, exploration, trade, production, and construction. You know, you get the list of all the details. But now, you can actually automate these and focus on key aspects of your playthrough, like military or diplomacy. It's a really great option for people like me who can get overwhelmed with these sorts of titles. Taken together, this is all looking very promising for both new and returning players. So if this sounds like the game for you, definitely check it out in the link in the description to pre-order now, and enjoy.
In this video, we shall be focused on the navies of the late 1500s, when warring lords vied for control of Japan. But we can rewind the clock back to provide some broader context. For much of preceding Japanese history, it seems that most naval forces were employed at a small scale for either raiding or policing the various rivers and seas of the country. To this end, local chieftains either operated or had the capacity to operate their own warships. Naturally, those with access to the coast and nearby trade routes tended to have a greater proclivity for armed maritime activities. Historically, this included the clans around the inland sea of Japan and along the southern seas of Honshu and Kyushu. The central government, meanwhile, does not seem to have maintained a strong standing navy. Instead, when it wished to raise a fleet for some campaign, it would turn to the provinces in a similar manner to the way in which troops were raised for armies. Details are sparse, but this appears to have occurred around 759 BC with the semi-legendary invasion of Korea, and again in 1019 with the repelling of a Jurchen raid. In times of civil war, large fleets might also materialize when various local forces pulled together to form more powerful coalitions. For instance, during the Genpei War at the end of the Heian period, the Taira and Minamoto factions clashed in a series of naval battles featuring over 1,000 ships. Yet, despite the scales involved, it does not seem that warships of this era were much distinct from their cargo or transport counterparts. Rather, they seem to have functioned as simple oar or sail-powered fighting platforms meant to transform sea battles into land affairs. This should be contrasted with contemporary warships of China, which were caught in an arms race of impressive development featuring huge trebuchet-armed ships within massive, well-organized standing navies. Even when the Mongols invaded in the late 1200s, Japanese naval forces had not much evolved from the days of their ancestors. Over the following centuries, the main reports of naval activity came from the Wako pirates, who gained international fame for their deadly raids across the seas of East Asia. Yet, even they failed to produce significant developments in the realm of naval warfare. It was only with the intensification of clan conflict, which accompanied the Sengoku Jidai of the 1500s, that a distinct class of dedicated warship was finally born to support more advanced forms of naval action. It is this force which we shall now be set to examine. Japanese naval construction had its roots in the common techniques employed by its continental neighbors. This called for the keel to be laid first, to which were then attached the first set of wide adjacent planks at a shallow angle. Next were added additional side planks at a steeper angle, which were joined together with pegs to make up the hull. The preference was to use the longest planks possible to preserve their natural strength and integrity. Skilled craftsmen prided themselves in assembling a watertight structure without the need for caulking. At this point, the ship would have resembled an open box. Next were added the heavy planks and rounded beams which made up the main deck and supports. After this would have been added the mast, rigging, rudder, and oars. As a final step, larger ships would have assembled a wooden fort atop this floating platform. Looking over such a vessel, we can appreciate the impressive scale and fine craftsmanship involved. Of particular note will be just how much space there is aboard these ships for men and materials. This has much to do with the way in which the oars were integrated into the design. East Asian oar propulsion was distinct from its European counterparts. Western rowing uses a distinct stroke and recovery cycle, wherein the oar blade is used to push directly against the water in the power stroke before being lifted out of the water on the recovery stroke. Eastern Yulo technique, on the other hand, uses a continuous figure-8 motion in the vertical direction, wherein the oar remains submerged, using its path to generate lift against the water. The advantage here is a constant, efficient, and ergonomic motion, whereby additional power can more easily be generated simply by adding more men per oar, rather than requiring more oars per ship. As we can see, this allows the rowers to be tucked in safely within the structure of the boat without the need for massive oar boxes and elevated seating arrangements. With this general ship description in mind, we can now turn to the various ship types. During the Sengoku period, a great range of ships would have been in operation for civilian, commercial, and military purposes. However, when it comes to combat, it seems that warships employed by the daimyo tended to be grouped into three categories of small, medium, and large ships, known respectively as kobayabune, sekibune, and atakebune. Though in practice there were considerable overlaps, for this video we will present generalized versions of each one. The Kobaya class ship was the smallest and lightest of the Navy, which typically acted as a scout or raiding vessel. It measured about 10 to 20 meters in length and 2 to 4 meters in width. Though some space existed in its shallow cargo hold, the bulk of the ship's occupants would have been positioned upon its open, planked main deck. From here, about 10 to 20 oarsmen would work to propel and steer the ship forwards. Out of combat, a sail could be employed to hasten travel. Joining the crew might be a complement of 5 to 15 Marines armed with a mix of melee and ranged weapons. Usually, such kobaya were kept light for their fast scouting and attack operations. However, they could be reinforced for combat. The most basic version of this involved hanging curtains from a wooden framework so as to intercept arrows. Yet, against heavier firepower, ships could be fitted with temporary shield walls behind which one could shelter and fire projectiles. Bundles of bamboo served a similar purpose and in later years would be used to fully enclose ships. Such variants, known as makura bune, typically featured arrays of flanking cannonry for naval sieges. Other kobaya-class craft might also have been augmented with a small podium or tower built onto the deck to enhance visibility and striking power of its crew. Ultimately, however, these sorts of upgrades overburdened such light attack craft and were thus typically reserved for the larger ships of the Navy. Instead, the kobaya would have to rely on its speed and maneuverability to win battles. The Sekibune class ship was a medium-sized vessel which served as the primary warship of Japanese fleets in this era. It typically measured 20 to 30 meters in length and 4 to 7 meters in width. As with the kobaya, it too had a shallow lower hold and planked main deck. However, owing to its greater size, atop this was constructed additional fortifications. This usually involved a perimeter barricade meant to fully enclose the ship's roughly 40 oarsmen and 30 Marines. Above this might also be incorporated a second-story fighting deck from whose parapet the crew would engage with the enemy. Thus armed, it was ready to wade into the thick of combat as the workhorse of most navies. The Atakebune class ship was a large vessel which acted as the heavy warship and flagship of Japanese navies. It typically measured 30 to 50 meters in length and 5 to 10 meters in width. The Atakebune's great size meant that huge multi-storied wooden castles could be built atop their frames. This included perimeter walls of thick wood with small loopholes for shooting and doors that could be opened for boarding action. The top decks featured similar defenses with additional cabins for guarding access to the interior. One or more sails were integrated into the superstructure with the ability to be folded down for combat. Aboard such monstrous ships could be found around 100 oarsmen and as many warriors. Given the prestigious nature of these large ships, they were often richly decorated with proud banners and artwork proclaiming the power of its master. In some cases, the daimyo who commissioned their construction even incorporated special upgrades. The tekosen, or ironclad, ship type, for instance, had been built by Oda Nobunaga to gain an advantage over his Mori rivals. Not only did these feature metal wall plates to withstand flaming and gunpowder weapons, but they also boasted multiple large-caliber cannons. It was an impressive innovation whose appearance preceded the Western form of the ironclad gunship by over 200 years. In this period of Japanese history, several even larger vessels, known as the O-Otakebune, were built. These proved capable of hosting even more troops and guns than any vessel thus far put to sea by the Japanese. Yet, owing to their lumbering size, they acted more as floating command fortresses than true warships. With this overview of the basic ship types in mind, we can now see how they worked together in naval formations. Fleets of this period were quite ad hoc in nature, owing to the fragmented militaries of the daimyos, as well as the varied size and conditions of the battles in which they were engaged. Thus, it will be best to present a generalized model. A smaller fleet might be expected to have a core of just a couple of the large-class Atakebune. Besides these would be deployed a support of a dozen or so of the medium-class Sekibune. And finally, screening this group would be several dozen or more of the small-class Kobayabune. All told, we might therefore count the fleet's total size at 40 warships, manned by 1,000 rowers and 800 warriors. Larger fleets seem to have been made up of multiple such small fleets, each of which operated in squadrons. There were many ways they could be deployed, with military manuals depicting idealized shapes meant for enacting various strategies. For our purposes, we can look at one of the more generic, well-rounded deployments. The standard 5-squadron formation placed the commander's flagship and its heavy escorts in the center rear of the fleet. On either flank would be an additional squadron of large vessels and their supports. Ahead of these would be 3 squadrons of lighter ships, with the front center one being composed of the greatest number of small, swift kobaya. Here, the fleet's total size can be approximated at 200 warships, manned by 5,000 rowers and 4,000 warriors. However, the numbers are just indicative, and the same formation might still be adopted if we scale up or down the unit counts. As with land battles, the basic idea here was that the frontline forces were meant to scout out and skirmish with the enemy. Meanwhile, the admiral in the center would have been expected to observe and command the unfolding action. If the frontline forces performed well, he could now choose to strategically commit reserves to overwhelm the enemy or perhaps target critical points on the battlefield. Alternatively, if the front squadrons fared poorly, they could now fall back to the bastion of heavy ships in the rear and prepare to make a stand alongside them. Such coordinated action was done by way of both audible and visual cues. For instance, nearby ships could use shouts, drums, and conch horns to sound various commands. Meanwhile, more distant ships used the movement of tall, color-coded flags and messenger boats to relay information. When battle was to be had, these ships would close with one another for contact. Initially, this meant an exchange of ranged missiles, consisting of arrows loosed from longbows and bullets fired by arquebuses. Towards the tail end of the Sengoku period, there was also an increasing presence of breech-loaded swivel guns mounted on the larger vessels. If the same ranges from land battles were applied, then this means that cannons could begin unleashing at around 800 meters. Next came the guns at a distance of anywhere from 100 to 200 meters, and finally the bows, which employed at a shorter distance of 30 to 50 meters. However, the tougher conditions of fighting on water likely meant that effective ranges were a bit shorter than usual. Thus it was that on the approach, ships would have attempted to soften each other up with missile volleys. Standard shots might have been aimed at crew members, while flaming projectiles could be used to target the vessels themselves. In the latter case, specialized incendiary bombs, or horukubia, were used, which could be swung by hand or by poles to hit targets 10 or 20 meters away. In these ranged exchanges, the larger ships had the advantage in cover, height, and numbers. At the same time, their size made them easy, slow-moving targets. It is therefore easy to imagine some of the asymmetries at play in such naval engagements. Yet, however long this initial ranged fight may have lasted, it seems that the ultimate objective was to eventually close the distance for boarding. This came out of a desire to actually capture enemy vessels alive and to engage in more prestigious forms of combat. Boarding would typically take place by first grappling enemy ships. This was commonly done by way of the kusari kagi, a chain hook weapon that could be affixed to a long rope and thrown over a boat's deck. To counter such devices, defenders often used the kama, a 3-meter-long sickle-bladed polearm which could be used to hack at the grappling lines from a distance. But if two ships did end up locked in close proximity, then the boarding would begin. The most basic means to do so would be to leap on to the opposing vessel. However, this was quite dangerous and only possible for ships of equivalent deck height. Thus, planks and bridges were more commonly deployed to facilitate the crossing. To this end, ships actually employed hinged wall sections that could be used as cover on the approach and then dropped for boarding action when the time came. Even masts could be used for these purposes. At the point where boarding began, the fighting would have devolved into a messy brawl. Soon, more ships would have joined themselves to the developing fight, leading to a chain event of boats being lashed together. The following is an illustrative description of the action at the 1183 Battle of Mizushima. Quote, "The ships were made fast alongside each other by hawsers from the stem and the stern, and between these other ropes were fastened, on which planks were stretched for walking, so that the whole fleet became like a level surface for fighting." While in many ways the combat resembled one fought on land, there was the obvious added danger of drowning in the seas for any who fell or abandoned ship. Ancient sources therefore recommended that samurai wear stripped-down versions of their gear with just the essential body and head armor. Apparently, there was even a form of life belt with buoyant floats available called the ukibukuro, which might be worn around the waist or breast. With these overviews in mind, we can now briefly cover a few illustrative scenarios of samurai fleets in action. With regards to the era of the Sengoku Jidai in the late 1500s, there would have been many smaller raids and skirmishes along the coasts and rivers of Japan. However, the largest sea clashes would come as the Mori clan attempted to resist the unification campaigns of Oda Nobunaga. For decades, the Mori had used their position along the Seto Inland Sea to exert control over key ports and trade routes across the region. Their reputation for naval tactics was affirmed in 1555 at the Battle of Miyajima, when they used a bold amphibious assault to defeat an entrenched enemy force twice their size. In the years that followed, the Mori would use their influence over the waves of southern Japan to forge alliances with other powerful factions. Thus it was that when Oda Nobunaga moved against the Iko-iki stronghold of Ishiyama Honganji in Osaka, the Mori were quick to support their allies by sea. Recognizing that victory would be impossible under such conditions, Oda Nobunaga ordered Admiral Kuki Yoshitaka to blockade the enemy's supply lines. What followed would be a fairly traditional clash at sea between dozens of ships at the mouth of the Kizu River. By now, the arquebus had made its way to the naval battlefield, and it seems that here, Mori's superiority won the day, as many Oda ships were shot down and set ablaze. The blockade faltered, allowing fresh supplies to reach the Iko-Iki. 2 years later, the siege still dragged on with no end in sight. Thus, Oda Nobunaga decided to redouble his naval efforts, this time with a new strategy. Rather than setting sail with the usual mix of ship types, he went all in with the construction of 6 super-heavy atakebune. Not only were these larger than the typical variant, but they also purportedly sported strong cannons and never-before-seen iron plate shielding. The extent to which the ships were encased is unclear, but if the reports are true, then these would have been the first ironclad warships in history. As the 6 new Tekusen-class ships descended upon Osaka Bay, the Mori fleet swarmed out to envelop them in what would come to be known as the Second Battle of Kizugawaguchi. This time, however, despite surrounding their prey, the attackers found that their cannonballs and bullets simply bounced off the Oda ships. Simultaneously, the powerful return fire from the ironclads proved devastating. Several Mori ships burst into flame or went down with giant holes ripped in their sides. Soon, the battle progressed into hand-to-hand combat. However, once again, the great size of the Oda ships made it difficult for smaller vessels to board them. Meanwhile, their own bridges had no issue dropping down upon and swarming lesser boats with assault parties. The battle was not going well for the Mori. Eventually, however, they did manage to mount some troops up the side of an ironclad. While this initial force was cut down, the redistribution of weight from the troops rushing to repel them apparently led the ship to begin listing and eventually capsizing. Yet by this point in the battle, it was too late to capitalize on this newfound weakness of the great ships. In the end, the Mori fleet was defeated, never again able to regain the advantage over its Oda rivals. The clash of fleets at Kizugawaguchi would be among the last of the large naval battles of the Sengoku Jidai. Though fleets still had their place when it came to raiding, blockading, transport and coastal bombardment, the bulk of the fighting returned to the land. However, with the end of the Sengoku Jidai and the reunification of Japan under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, there came a newfound need for naval action with the 1592 invasion of Korea. In the ensuing Imjin War, nearly 1,000 ships were said to have been marshaled for the campaign. These were first staged at Tsushima Island before making the remaining 50-kilometer crossing of the Straits to Korea. Among this massive fleet were supposedly 300 warships of various size and over 700 transports and support vessels. But the prized jewel of them all was Hideyoshi's own flagship, the Nihon Maru. It featured a 3-story keep with 18 mat rooms surrounded by whitewashed walls under a graceful curved roof. Around it was hung an ornate brocade curtain, and atop it all was the sacred Mount Horai. Altogether, the sight of this combined samurai fleet must have been impressive to behold, and yet, in the days ahead, it would meet its match in the form of Korean Admiral Yi's fleet and its infamous turtle ships. But that fascinating showdown shall have to be covered another time. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us on Patreon to participate in polls, catch script previews, and get HD downloads of all our art. We owe a huge debt to our current patrons for funding the channel and to our researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without this team and this community. So be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.